Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. It's inevitable. You're listening to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, a family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. The only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, turn off the podcast now. Also, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, this is an interjection from the end of the episode here. Just wanted to give an extra notice. This conversation was philosophical and it definitely turned a bit theological. So we invite you to still listen to this episode if you're not coming from a Christian perspective or anything. But if you are coming from a different belief system, we just wanted to give you that heads up. I think it would still be beneficial for you to hear the argument of the Euthypro Dilemma and free will from that Christian perspective that bleeds into the theological and how that affects the Christian faith, since we are doing a Genesis 1-11 study. But if that's not your cup of tea, then you may want to skip on to the next episode at this point. Trace, I'll kick it off to you for our fish fact.
All right, so first one of today is a siphonophore. So it's actually not really just one creature, but it's a colony of individual parts called zooids. So one example of this would be if you know what the man of war is. It's like a jellyfish kind of thing that floats on the top of the surface. It's actually not a jellyfish, it's one of these siphonophores. And these things, they can get very long. I think, the largest ever recorded was almost 50 feet in diameter and 154 feet long.
Dang. And is this like a deep, sea creature, or is this more like surface?
Yeah, no, I mean, it all depends, I think. Because the man of war is strictly surface. They float on top of the surface.
Right.
But a lot of other ones are like deep sea kind of creatures.
Now, I know that there's certain types of battleships and everything from the 1500s, 1600s that were called man of war. I wonder if what came first with the name, if it was the jellyfish or if it was the warship. Now I only know that from playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag, so that's a questionable source for education on history material. I figured you'd appreciate that, though, being a huge pirate lover and everything.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because I know that there's certain types of deep sea things like the squid, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this because you're the fish nerd here. But my understanding is that the giant squids generally are only in the deep parts of the ocean, and their bigger structure helps contribute to them being able to take the added water pressure of being deeper under the sea. Is that correct, or am I mistaken in my understanding?
It's not really the size of them that helps. Because whales and stuff, they're the biggest thing. They can't go that deep. It all depends on body structure and stuff. Squids, they're squishy, so they can kind of take that pressure. Blobfish is another good example. They're a lot of deep sea animals are actually very small. So all the scary animals that you might see, I want to use that term lightly here because I don't think scary should be the word we use for them.
Let's be real here. There's a lot of things that are deep in the ocean that do look kind of freaky, though.
Oh yeah, no, they're weird looking guys, but I don't think we should be scared of them because they are like 5 inches long most of the time. Or I know there are some big ones. It's not just 5 inches long, but they do get pretty small, and it all just depends on body structure. And the blobfish, it actually doesn't look like that giant mucousy pink slime ball. It's actually like a normal looking fish down in its proper depth, and it's just because it's built to be down there. And I also did look it up. The Portuguese man of war, which is the siphonophore, was named after the ship.
Okay, so it was the ship that came first. Okay, good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thanks for filling in those gaps there, Trace. Learning something new every day. Got to learn something new on musings on mysteries in the mythical matrix, even if it's not mystery or mythical related, right?
Oh yeah.
So some follow-ups from last episode here. First thing I'm going to talk about is that we do have ads running, and I'll apologize because it's probably not been the most pleasant listening experience for our listeners up until this point. If you're listening on YouTube, you have no clue what I'm talking about, because all of this stuff is running on Spotify, and they're running embedded into the audio itself that Spotify is using, so it's not Spotify specific ads. So there's whatever Spotify ads you're listening to if you're not paying for premium. And then we also have our own ads embedded from our podcasting platform. So this is to help us recoup costs and everything. And I think at the current rate we're at, in like 5 years of podcasting, I'll have finally recouped all the money that I invested in audio equipment and everything else that I needed for this podcast. So this is, I know it's a little bit, what's the word here? Might not be the most pleasant thing to have to listen to and everything, but we do really appreciate your patience on that as the listener, as that helps us recoup costs and keep the podcast going and everything. At the very least, it helps us just recoup what we need to make this podcast work. So with that being said, I'm going to try in the future to actually handle the ads a bit better. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to actually do specific ad breaks and announce it, so it's not just interjecting into the middle of our conversation and interrupting, breaking through the wall like the Kool-Aid man and screaming, "Oh yeah!" Actually have a little bit of a heads up that there's an ad coming. So my current plan for that is to try to take an ad break, every maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, and try to just keep it down to one ad so it's not too uncomfortable for you as the listener to have to suffer through. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of explain that and everything. Another thing that annoyed me too was that there was pre-roll ads. So like before you heard anything from the podcast, you would hear the ad roll. And that was something that was kind of annoying to me, where it's like, hey, you're coming to listen to the podcast. I want you guys to be able, and girls and whoever else is listening, to be able to actually hear the podcast right off the bat and not have to hear an ad like before you start. So I did away with that. I've tried my best to clean it up. The software that I'm using is a little bit difficult sometimes. But anyway, I'm rambling at this point, so I'll stop talking about ads for now, and we'll actually take a quick ad break right about now. And we're back. So we'll pick up here. Another announcement too is we've also decided Wednesday is going to be our target release day for the podcast. So you're wondering when the next episode is going to come out. We're going to try to release it every single Wednesday. Now, there might be certain exceptions where we miss a week, but we're going to try to front load and record a whole bunch of different podcasts ahead of time so that you as the listener don't miss out. One other thing I wanted to follow up on from Genesis 3 is something. This is an important detail I missed. Trace, what was the fruit in the Garden of Eden?
Oh, was it ever actually named? I know it's kind of typically depicted as like an apple. But...
you got my trick question there. So it is depicted as an apple, but nowhere in the Genesis 3 account does it say that the fruit in the Garden of Eden was an apple. So no, it's not a sin to eat an apple. Another thing, last episode, there was some occasional screeching and screaming in the background. I do apologize. That is my child. She's in another room, but she's definitely loud at certain points. So please bear with me as you may occasionally hear small screams here and there. It's not someone being hurt in any capacity. She's just a very rambunctious and excited child. But love her very much. Interesting joke that I'm going to bring back. The Flat Earth Society has members all around the globe. If you didn't get that one the first time, think about it for a second. The Flat Earth Society has members all around the globe. So that being said, I'm not getting many laughs from Trace. If I had a cricket sound effect, I'd be playing it right now. So Trace, we missed a creature fact last episode. So we're going to have you do 2 creature facts. So you can go ahead and give us the first one at the beginning here to make up for last episode, and then we'll hit on the next creature fact that you have at the end of this episode. So go ahead and kick us off with that.
Yes. So, I know we talked about dragons a couple of times last episode, so I wanted to. Well, in all reality, I kind of stumbled on this trying to find a little fact, but the word dragon occurs 21 times in the Old Testament in the King James version, and 13 times in the New Testament. So in the King James version, I think that's the only one that it's actually translated in. It's 35 times mentioned in that version. Now, the KJV was written in 1611, so you could say that that was a time for um, a lot of dragon stories to go around. So that's probably the cause of it.
Okay, and this is the specific like translations and everything of the Bible, like the English translation of it, not the original Hebrew and Greek. Yes, that's just how many times that word was translated into English.
Yeah, so from what I could see is that it's just the King James version that dragons is mentioned 35 times.
Okay. Yeah, so that's an interesting insight here. So let's expand on that one, actually, because I was doing research for one of our future episodes, because you were wanting to talk about Satan a little bit and kind of how appearances of him have changed over time and why he's depicted in so many different ways. There's definitely a lot more biblical insight into that than I actually realized initially. I didn't think there were that many verses, and I started looking into it, and I was very surprised. So it's relevant to our Genesis 3 discussion, so this is going to be our last major follow-up here, is I'm going to read from Revelations chapter 12, and then I'm going to read verse 9 here. And the great dragon was cast down, the old serpent, he that is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was cast down to the earth, and his angels were cast down with him. And so in Genesis, it just says serpent. We're not really given any specific insight as to what Satan is, or if it even is Satan in the garden explicitly. But this verse here from Revelation gives us a very clear and delineated understanding that serpent and dragon go interchangeably in this essence, and it's referring to Satan. So it's a very clear connection of Satan being that snake in the garden in Genesis 3, talking about him being the deceiver. Yeah, so the Greek word here, because this is Greek, we're talking Revelation now. The Greek word is drakon, to refer to dragon, so very, very literal and clear usage there. And the word for snake is ophis, and they're shown to be synonymous in this instance. So that would indicate that it's a serpent-like dragon that's being referred to here, and that would likely have been referred to as well in Genesis 3. Another interesting thing to note here is it does reference angels falling because of Satan, and he brought angels with him. This is something we'll explore further when we actually do our Book of Enoch study, because we are going to get to that. And I don't know how much you know about that, Trace, but that's actually not canonical scripture. That is external of scripture. There's a number of different scholars that would argue that the Book of Enoch is potentially a forgery, or at the very least written, I don't want to say forgery, but it was written several thousand years after Enoch lived, supposedly. So its origin is questioned, but I think that there's still insight and value to offer there, as the book of Jude in the Bible actually cites Enoch. So that's something we'll explore more, and we'll explore this idea of Satan bringing down fallen angels and everything with him when he falls. And one last thing I'm going to clear up on this sub point here. We've talked about in our Genesis deconstruction about how we don't take the verse from 2 Peter 3:8, which is that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. And we can't use that to translate Genesis 1 and 2 and their interpretation of day. But here I am using a verse from Revelation 12:9, to kind of translate and expound upon what serpent means from Genesis 3. And so I want to address this because this might seem like a contradiction on the surface level, but it's not. It's context. The context here is that 2 Peter is talking about judgment, and it's talking about God's patience, and that's kind of the overall context that's being set, is that there's a judgment coming, and that God doesn't mind waiting a little bit because time is irrelevant to him, and that's the concept that's being communicated here. In Revelation, we are being told a specific description about Satan from the beginning, and he's being described as a serpent here. So this is giving us insight to Genesis 3 to be able to take this idea of Satan being a serpent and a dragon and then to apply it back, if that makes sense. Do you think I explained that properly, Trace, or do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's pretty solid.
Yeah, I don't want any of our listeners to think that I'm contradicting myself, or that I'm misapplying logic and I'm cherry picking things to make it fit my ends and what I'm trying to communicate. There's a very clear reason for everything that I'm picking here, and I just want that to be clear for everyone. So with that being said, unless you have any other thoughts you want to interject, Trace, we're going to kick into the actual episode content here.
Let's do it. Let's jump into it.
Sweet. We're going to take a quick break here for an ad, and then we're going to be off. All right, and we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers, and we are going to kick off into the episode content. So for this episode, the Euthypro Dilemma and free will, that is the topic. So this is going to be much more of a philosophical episode. I figured it'd be a good idea to give everyone a break from the denser material, the denser interlinear study of Genesis that we've been doing thus far, and to just kind of have some fun and play with some ideas here. So, what is the Euthypro Dilemma? The Euthypro Dilemma is, I believe, from Socrates, and it's Socrates talking to this Greek hero Euthypro, and he presents this dilemma to him, and he says, is something good because the gods will it, or do the gods will something because it is good? And Socrates and Euthypro kind of go back and forth on this. Euthypro, initially takes one side, and then Socrates pokes holes in it, and then Euthypro takes the other side, and then Socrates pokes holes in it, and Euthypro's eventually just like, you know what? I'm done with you, you crazy old kook. I'm out of here. Bye. And he leaves. And that's just kind of the general concept of the whole Euthypro Dilemma and how it went. But it does beg a really good question. And so I'll ask you this, Trace. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good?
Oh. I don't think I necessarily agree with either of those, to be honest.
Really? And why is that?
Okay, say the first part again, because I get the gist of it, but you know the quote.
Yeah, so is something good because the gods will it, or do the gods will something because it is good?
So, okay. That's so much.
Okay, so let's take it piecemeal here, one at a time, so that our listeners, because you and I are used to kind of playing with these ideas. Our listeners may or may not, depending on their education level and how much they've thought about this and explored, comparative mythology, ancient Greek, and all of that. That's not a diss on anyone. That's just acknowledging we potentially will have a wide base of listeners. So, is something good because the gods will it? So, that idea implies that this. I'll refer to it from the original argument source here of ancient Greek. So that would imply the idea that, Zeus, Apollo, all of the Greek gods, that they will something, therefore it is good. Specifically, that they could will things that would contradict each other's guidance, and it would still be good. Versus the idea, do the gods, the Greek gods, will something because it is good? This idea implies that there is a deeper rooted good that exists beyond these Greek gods. Does that make sense? Does that kind of boil it down a little bit for you, help you understand it a little better?
Kind of. I think it's just because they're two similar sayings that it's just confusing. Like it's screwing with my brain a lot. But okay. I have this in front of me. It's a little different than what you're saying, but it's saying, do the gods love good action because it is good, or is good action good because it's loved by the gods?
Yes.
So I would say, now that I have this kind of in front of me, I kind of do agree with the gods love good action because it is good. Because I don't think just because an action is loved by the gods doesn't mean that it's good. Because
Okay, let's clarify what you're
if this is
saying.
from Greek,
Let's clarify what you're saying here. Are you talking specifically about the Greek demigods, or are you talking about the God of the Bible in your answer here? Or are you
I'm gonna
talking
say
about
both.
both? You're going to say both. Okay.
Yeah, because if this is from Greek, it's obviously coming from a Greek god idea, and a lot of the actions of the gods are good. So
Yeah,
I
there
feel
was
like that kind of invalidates that right off the bat, because the Greek gods are interesting people.
definitely a lot of yeah, and I didn't put any trigger warnings here, so we're not going to get into much about the Greek gods. There's a lot of very R-rated content from the Greek gods that is very questionable when you really dive into it all. And there's a lot of very clear issues present. That'll all play into a lot of discussions we have later, building off of Genesis 6. But so yours, let me make sure I understand where you're coming from and what your conclusion on this is, Trace. Because I hit you with this on the fly. I didn't give you any prep time. You're just kind of deciding what you think. So I want to communicate that for the listeners. This isn't like a pre-recorded, pre-rehearsed, anything like that. This is like, I'm literally hitting Trace with this right now. I did not tell him what the Euthypro Dilemma was or anything. He heard it on air the second that you heard him hear it on air. So what you're saying, Trace, is that both the Greek gods and the God of the Bible will something. They like the idea of something. They agree with something because of an overarching concept of good. That's what you're saying? Or am I misunderstanding you?
That's so many words.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know
I
how to
think so.
boil
Yeah,
that down.
I know this is gonna be a hard episode for me.
We might not do as many
Um,
philosophical episodes after this. Trace might be like, you know what? I'm done. Um,
I need to be like in the mindset for it, and I just woke up a couple hours ago. I'm like not mentally prepared for this deep dive into the psyche.
Tell you what, we'll do like a super short break here for another ad, and then that'll give you like another maybe minute or so to gather your thoughts.
Okay.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers, with Trace's put together thoughts, at least hopefully. What do you have for us, Trace?
I wouldn't say they're really all that put together, but anyway, as I said, would disagree with the second part that is it a good action because it's loved by the gods. So no, I wouldn't say that because there's a lot of quote unquote good actions that would either just like the gods are bad is pretty much what I'm saying. Or so I think there is a defined moral of good. So I'm gonna agree with the first part of that. Gods love good action because it's good.
Okay, so then you're faced with a dilemma if you apply this to the God of the Bible, because and the Greek gods as well. If you're approaching it from a Greek mythology perspective and actually worshiping Greek gods, the dilemma you're faced with here is that then there is something greater than the gods. There is a overarching principle of good that has more power and has more authority than what these gods have. So what do you think about that?
In the Greek god standpoint, yes, I would say that there's definitely the morals override the power of the gods. But with the biblical god, it gets a little more tricky.
Yeah.
uh, I would say with the biblical God, it might switch sides then.
So whatever
Well,
the
no, because what if the biblical God like defined? I mean, I don't know if there's anything from the Bible to back this up, but if like the biblical God defined the moral of good, that's a standpoint, and then everything kind of refers back to that. It's not necessarily like his ideas are what's judging everything. Does that make sense?
So he created an overall principle of good then. So he is then therefore more powerful than good and dictates what good is.
Yeah, because I'm sure there's some questionable things in the Bible that you might not say are necessarily good, like the flood. I wouldn't say that was. I mean, like, I'm sure you could get into the specifics of all that, but like at a quick glance of the flood, you wouldn't say killing the entire world is a good action.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in our Genesis 6 study as to why specifically the flood happened and why the flood actually, from a moral standpoint, did need to happen. But yeah, so you're saying that God determines good. Are you saying that the flood was like a bad thing that God did, or like
I
what are
mean,
you trying to say with that?
so like I said, if it's the Greek gods, I would say the first one works. Do gods love good action because it is good?
Right.
So that I would decide on for the Greek gods. But with the biblical God, I would say it switches to it's a good action because it is loved by the gods. I don't think biblical God necessarily loved flooding the world, you know?
Right.
So like that wouldn't be a good action. You could say it's a necessary action, but it's not a good action.
Right.
Now,
Well, it depends how you define good, I guess. Is it a good thing that there's all that death? No. But is it good from, an objective moral standpoint? I mean, is it good that we killed Nazis in World War II?
yeah.
All right, I'm gonna put you out of your misery here. It's a trick question, and when you're talking about the God of the Bible, when you're talking about the God of the Bible, it has to be both. God is good and good is God. Their nature has to be intertwined. So God wills something because he is good, and God is good, therefore he wills it, if that makes sense. It's both sides of the dilemma. God fits both bills. The nature of God being good is the definition of good, but God is also his own being. Does that make sense?
Okay. I think so.
I know we're playing with some really deep philosophical concepts here and everything, so it's definitely, if you need a minute to chew on stuff, let me know. We're not quite to the point of taking another quick ad break or anything yet, but gives you just let me know if you kind of need a second to play with ideas, or you want me just to kind of continue on.
Okay.
These are definitely some deep concepts I'm playing with here, but I wanted to do this to set up the conversation for free will. So as we noted in Genesis 3, when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden, lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. And the ESV translation actually kind of indicated that was like an incomplete sentence from God almost, like literally like it was being said by God, and then he immediately took action. Lest man takes from the tree and eats from the tree of life and lives forever, and then, end of quote, kicks Adam and Eve out. This indicates that God is not all powerful in the way that we think sometimes, or we think, oh, God can literally do anything. It's like, well, yes, but no. There are certain things that God is bound by in his nature. And we touched on this last episode a little bit when we were talking about how God imbued the tree of life with so much power, he wouldn't be able to undo the action if Adam and Eve ate from the tree of life. So there are bounds that God puts on himself from his nature and from his actual creation and from the definitions of what he's creating. Does that make sense? This is the point I'm trying to get at here by the Euthypro Dilemma.
Yes.
All right, cool. So let's reread Genesis 2:15 and 17. And I clicked to switch this into American Standard Version, and it didn't. All right, there we go. And Jehovah God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. And Jehovah God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayst freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And I'm kind of translating that on the fly because it kind of reads like the King James, and that's a mouthful. So God creates the tree, and he puts the tree in the garden. So God gives Adam a choice here. There is free will involved. So what do you think about the concept of free will, Trace? Do you have anything you want to interject or add into that?
Oh man, I've had plenty of thoughts about it for sure, but I never really reached a point where I can confidently say like, here's my standpoint on it. But it's definitely been a thought of like, what is it?
Yeah, and we're not trying to get into the free will versus predestination argument because that's another whole theological discussion in and of itself. Right now, we're just talking about the idea of free will. And specifically, I want to take this idea and I want to follow it to its conclusion here. So, how can a good God send people to hell? This is a question that's brought up quite a lot. And it kind of plays into the free will idea of like, well, God is creating these people and knowing that they're going to go to hell. How could a good, loving God do that? I want to take this question, I want to challenge it, and I want to play with it. So I know we're hitting a lot of deep concepts here, Trace, but take everything that we've been talking about thus far and apply it to this idea. What thoughts do you have to interject on that?
On the idea of why does a good God send people to hell?
Yeah, well, not even just that, but like if God can do quote unquote anything, why would he create people knowing that they're going to go to hell? Because then, if God can do anything, then he could just not create people that he knows are going to hell, right? Like he could just say, "Oh, I'm not going to create these people so that they don't have to live and then, go to hell because, eternal suffering and all of that."
Yeah, it's hard to really bring that up, I guess. At least for me. Just because all I can think of is just like, why would he do that? What's the point of doing anything if like that's what's gonna happen?
Yeah, so even Paul had a hard time answering this in the New Testament because he asked, I think it's like, I want to say Romans 8 or 9, where he says, well, he kind of lays out an argument similar to what I've been discussing here. And he says, well, how can God find fault then? And then he answers his own question and says, oh, but who are you, oh man, to answer back at God, to talk back to God? And I think it's important to preface this conversation with that and say Paul didn't even have an answer, but I don't think there's anything wrong with speculating on it either. So unless you have some other thoughts you want to interject, Trace, that have come to you, I'm going to kind of jump in here and guide the conversation a little more.
Please guide away. I'm so
lost in the sauce. No, that's fine. I wanted to, and I told you this one, I think when we took our short pause for an ad there, I wanted you to take this on the fly so we can have this conversation and so the listeners could hear it and not hear a pre-scripted conversation. I want this to be an authentic and real conversation that's had on the air that we might even circle back to and talk about, have a whole other episode dedicated to the subject in the future.
I'm not faking it. I am just an idiot. To be clear.
No, dude, if you're an idiot, I'm equally an idiot here, man. I've eaten crayons before now, so God is not able to do just anything. And I want to clarify what I mean by that is that there are certain things that he is just bound to by his nature. There are certain things that he can do, and there are certain things that he cannot do. For example, let's take Jesus being tempted in Matthew 4, when Jesus is tempted by the devil in the desert after 40 days of fasting. If Jesus had sinned, being fully God, if Jesus had chosen to bow down and worship Satan, let's say, I think that, from a Christian perspective, I think that the whole universe would have just imploded inside and out and ceased to exist, because then God has defied his nature and he's no longer God in a sense. And everything in our reality and outside of our reality would just collapse. So there are certain things that God cannot do. He cannot defy his nature. He cannot defy himself. So I would propose this question as an answer to the free will discussion and why God would create people he knows are going to go to hell. What if, in the definition of creating true free will, because we're created in God's image, right? So man is created in the image of God. What if to have free will as a being created in God's image, God has to be hands off to give us true free will? Like he can't discriminate on who he creates and doesn't create. Maybe just by the definitions and the nature of God and the deep underlying principles that define who God is, he is bound by these constraints. Does that make sense? To be who God is, he has to follow these rules. So it's not saying that these things, not to circle back around to the Euthypro Dilemma, it's not saying that these principles are more powerful than God, but they define God. And because they define God, he has certain constraints he has to operate in that he cannot break out of. And so I would propose that as my answer to the question of how could God create people he knows are going to go to hell? Because to give man free will by his nature, by the definition of who he is, by the definition of creating someone in his image, he has to not discriminate. He has certain guidelines he has to follow. Like if you're to perform a certain action, I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. If you were to, like, there's like implied tasks. So like if you were to open up your computer, Trace, to send an email, and you were doing it from, from total scratch, taking the computer out of the box, what's the first thing you have to do if you want to, send an email? If you just got a new computer and you want to send an email off of it, what's the first thing you have to do?
Turn it on.
You have to turn it on. Then you got to create an account. Then you got to sign in. Then you got to set up all your preferences. Then you got to sign into your email account. All of those things go into just sending an email, from the beginning of something. So when we say sending an email with a new computer, there's all of these implied tasks that fall into that category. And so I would argue that these implied tasks here on who, let me rephrase that who God is and his action of creating man and giving man these rights and privileges has implied tasks that fall in it, much like emailing from a brand new computer. Does that make sense? This is kind of me answering the question for you and giving you a little bit more of a nudge in the perspective that I have.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Like, what do you have any thoughts to add, or is it all just so new you kind of need to play with it for a bit?
I need to play with it for a bit.
Yeah, that's fine. And we can always do a follow-up in the next episode or two as well, to answer anything else that comes up. We can, and I certainly want to circle back to this conversation if anyone else has any thoughts to add, you or guests or whoever. So actually, I'll do a quick plug right now. For those of you that are listening, even if you're listening like 2-3 years down the road, we're recording this in 2024. If you're listening in like 2026, 2027, and you have an interesting thought you want to add to this, email us, m.quad.musings@gmail.com, m.quad.musings@gmail.com. Send us the episode number, please, so I can go back and hear what specifically, and approximately like a timestamp of like what point you're referring to, if you have a specific thing you want to address. Or if you just want to add a thought to the whole conversation, just send us an email and be like, hey, here's my thoughts on this. And then we'll either do like a listener communication, like discussion on that, or we'll actually do a whole episode on that, maybe even if you have a deep enough thought that really warrants like a good 30-40 minute conversation. I want to have these conversations, and I want to have them with our listeners. That being said, we're going to take another short pause here, Trace, to do an ad, and we will be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers, we are back talking about the Euthypro Dilemma and free will. And we just finished giving you all of our contact info because we want this to be an ongoing conversation. So, a couple other points I want to touch on, unless you have any other revelations that came to you, Trace, while that ad was playing.
Yeah, so I do have one question here. So we have free will. You say God has to follow a set of rules. So does that mean that God has free will or not? Since he has to follow all these rules and he can't go outside of his nature. Like for people, a lot of times we have to kind of go. I mean, some people will, some people won't, but like I would argue that some people have an inherent nature that they have to go against. Like let's say my nature is inherently violent, or I mean honestly you could, this is a whole other thing, but like honestly you could say that humankind is inherently has a violent nature in some aspects.
That's interesting you say that, because
Whether it
there's a
be
lot of people that would
physical or
actually, sorry to cut you off there. That's interesting you would say that, because there's actually a lot of people that would say that humanity has a good nature deep down, and that humanity is intrinsically good, and that these ideas of humanity being bad are imposed on humanity by religion. So it's interesting you say that. We'll follow. I just want to kind of interject that real quick, because that is on the conversation agenda for this episode, but we'll follow up on that. So I apologize for interrupting you there. Go ahead and continue with your thought.
well, I have some more thoughts on that too. But yeah, like a lot of people would have to, if they like have different ideas that go against their nature, they have to fight against their nature. So like
And so
why
now we're getting more to the theological side of things, because Paul talks a lot about this in his New Testament letters, about wrestling with your sin nature. And that's what I think you're talking about there. There's a verse where Paul talks about, the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I do. And that's him talking about and admitting. I don't have a specific citation for that verse. I apologize. Half the time when I retain scripture, I don't retain the citation. I retain the principle and like the general verbiage of it. So I don't have a citation for that. If that's a burning question on someone's mind, I'm sure you can just Google it. Worst case, email the show. I'll have an answer for it. But this is something Paul talks about, is that there is a constant wrestling against our natures at certain points. And this nature comes in with the fall. So we have a sin nature that enters from a Christian perspective. We have a sin nature that enters into us that we then have to wrestle with. And we have to fight to do the right thing. We have to counter those violent tendencies. We have to, counter whatever sinful inclinations that we may have. And this is a principle that's very clearly laid out and defined in the whole New Testament, more or less. This is the whole point of having laws and everything, if you will, because we want to do our own thing. God has his standards of good, and he does not conform to our specific subjective standards of good or bad. And so while we might agree with God on a lot of things, maybe, most people might say, oh, murdering people, that's bad and everything like that. There might be, something else that some of us wrestle with that God would define as bad, but we, in our sinful nature would not define as bad. We all have kind of like our Achilles heel of sin nature, if you will. We all have our areas of weaknesses.
yes, but that still, I don't know. I feel like that still doesn't satisfy the question of does God have free will or not.
Well, right. Yeah, I was answering the second part of your question, so I wanted to make sure I addressed that efficiently, and then we'll circle back to what you just said here. So does God have free will? Let me ask you a question to answer your question. Do people have the ability to choose what they eat?
Yeah.
So people have the ability to choose. So like if you just said, you know what, we did a good episode, I'm going to go down to the fridge, you would have the ability, you know, if you have both orange juice and milk in the fridge, you'd have the ability to choose milk or orange juice. Or if you're a complete heretic and you wanted to mix them together, you could absolutely do something disgusting like that too.
Why would you say that?
But no,
No.
you could do that, right? Like you would have the ability to do that.
Oh,
So
I mean, yeah.
So-
You could.
but now what if you chose not to eat or drink anything and you chose to just let yourself disintegrate and die? You know, you would cease to exist. So I say all this to try to apply it to the broader principle of God here. So God has the ability to choose to do or not to do certain things, you know, outside of his of violating his nature. But you know, we as humans have a very, I guess, fluid nature, where we can choose to be good or we can choose to be evil, and that's given to us by free will, in the sense of being able to choose good and evil. Now, God still has free will, but God, by his nature and who he is, by definition of who he is very static in his definition. He does not have the free will to sin. And if he does sin, everything would collapse down. Does that kind of circle back around and answer your first premise there?
I don't know.
Well, we can have this as an ongoing conversation if you want to close it there, or if you have thoughts you want to interject, or if you just kind of want to mull it over and talk about it in, you know, a couple weeks or something.
We can talk about it later.
Okay, sounds good. Give you some time to think and to reflect. But yeah.
Yeah, re-listen to the episode then.
Yeah, there you go. So one other thing I want to touch on, when people talk about God sending people to hell, they really focus on the merciful aspects of God, but they forget that God is just and good as well. And when we're defining God this way, which he has to be defined in this way for him to work as an idea, when we're defining God as good and God intertwined, he has to have certain standards that cannot be compromised. And we can't impose those standards on him. Whatever standards he says would have to go if good and God are intertwined in this way. And it would be, because that's how it would have to work. That's the only way it would logically flow and make sense. So when you ask the question, how can a merciful God send people to hell? Well, yes, he is merciful because God is love, but there is also the just side to God, and God has to fulfill his nature of good and who he is. And that was the whole intent of sending Jesus, you know, and this is getting a little theological. So for any non-Christian listeners out there, I'll apologize if this upsets you in any way, but that's the whole point of God sending Jesus to die, is to satisfy that just side that God has to have satisfied by his, not just because God like needs that, like on a, oh, I want to do this. No, that's something God needs by his nature and the definition of his character and who he is. He has to have a sacrifice to atone for the sin that's occurred. But then on the flip side, you know, God wants to be merciful, and he wants to have us back and to not have us be stuck in this fallen state. So he wants to give us that choice and that way out. And that is the whole essence of the gospel and the intents of everything there. Anything to add on that, Trace? Or am I still just blowing your mind here?
I'm just trying to think of that one video where it's just a guy with like, he's doing that mind explosion thing, and there's like the galaxies and stuff all around him. That's how I kind of feel right now.
Oh yeah, like the Enlightenment ones. Yeah, it's definitely deep. It's deep content, and I've struggled with my faith because of these questions. So I want to tackle these questions for our listeners, not to force Christianity down their throat, but to say, hey, if you're wrestling with these questions, here's some thoughts to think about, and let's talk about this. Like it's not me trying to ram anything down anyone's throat. You know, we've talked about this how many times. It's like we're kind of confused. You know, if you think we're trying to ram stuff down your throat and you're not interested to have these conversations, we're kind of confused at this point as to why you're still listening on episode 6 now. But like, it's not about trying to ram anything down anyone's throat. We're trying to ask these questions that people are asking and struggling with, and then provide ideas to the answers for these questions, because they are questions worth asking. You can't out reason yourself from your faith. Like, well, maybe you can, but if you fully explore everything and you are honest with yourself and you're not letting emotions fuel the argument, asking questions and reasoning is not bad for your faith. It's actually essential for your faith, because you don't want to have blind faith. Blind faith is bad. Blind faith is dangerous. Blind faith will make you believe anything at a quick glance. You have to have logically explored and based faith. You have to have a reason for your faith. Otherwise, that's just dangerous territory getting into the blind faith area. So I want to ask these questions. They deserve to have answers to them. They deserve to have a conversation. And so that's, again, where you as a listener, if you have a thought you want to interject into this whole conversation, send it to us. We'll talk about it. I think this podcast will be going for some years. I was working this week, and I generated content list for like a year and a half in advance. So we've got a lot of material, and I've like barely scratched the surface of everything I even want to get into in a year and a half, doing an episode every week. So the idea is that we'll be doing podcasting for a long while. So ask these questions, please. Like, if you have thoughts, interject them. Unless you have something you want to add to that, Trace, let's do a quick ad break here, and then we'll tackle our last topic.
All right. Then go for it.
All right. We will be right back after this brief ad. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, all of you with confirmation bias, because there are definitely a lot of you out there. Last thing I want to talk about, human nature being good or bad. I thought it was really interesting that you brought up the idea that human nature at its core does seem to be intrinsically bad and violent. Can you expound on that a little bit for us, Trace? Because I've been talking a good bit of this episode and hitting you with a lot of blind sides and everything. So I want to get some thoughts on you to explain your perspective here a little.
Yeah, no, this whole episode feels like you've just been hitting me with left and right hooks constantly. It's just like, I can't. Much. Anyway.
I'm sorry, bro. I wanted you to take it on the fly so that we could get that authentic reaction from the listeners, and then you have something to play with and think about, in your mind, that we can circle back around to. So yeah, I'm not trying to just pick on you and annoy you. It's like there's an actual intent here. Is I want to have these unfiltered conversations, if you will. Unless you slip profanity in there, in that case, I'm gonna blip it out and scream at you. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I feel like I'm just kind of a guy that's just to say, like, hey, you're not the only one confused, to the listeners.
Yeah, well, we talked about this. You're the resident skeptic. That's your job. And so I can't let you be too prepared as the resident skeptic. I have to hit you with stuff on the fly.
That's true. But so I think that human nature is inherently violent, because you could take a look at babies. You have one. They like to scream and get angry a lot, throw things, hit things, whatever. I mean, probably case by case, that I'm sure there's some exceptions there, but like at the start, it's a lot of big emotions, I want to say, and a lot of that is taken out physically or stuff like that. So I think that you could make an argument for both, because I think deep down there's an underlying good nature of it, but that has to come out through the gaining of knowledge, I would say. It's like a lot of the violent people, they might be stuck in a certain worldview, if that makes sense. Like they only stick to their point of view, that they think, whatever they're doing is right or a necessity, or it's just that they would enjoy doing it or something like that. But I think if you have that open mind, or you learn more about a subject, that you would then switch from bad to good. So let's say, oh, what's a good example here? Snakes. Let's let's do snakes. So, um, I know we talked about, I can't remember if it was last episode or the episode before, where we talked about the, I'm probably gonna screw up this word here, but the enmity um between snakes and the offspring of Eve or whatever. So like at a start, quick glance, you're gonna be scared of the snake and you're not gonna like it. But if you learn more about snakes, then you're like, oh, you know what? This is actually pretty cool. And then your nature changes based on that. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is, as you kind of ascend to steal maybe more of a new age term, and as you kind of ascend to a higher enlightenment level, that your nature will kind of change in a sense to match that.
Yeah, yeah. So I think like I may be messing up the definition of inherently here, but like inherently would mean like at the start, at the beginning, right?
I'm not sure on that one. Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask for definitions on the fly. I can look that up for you.
Here, yeah, I can look it up too here.
Yeah,
Uh,
inherent is the natural or innate manner according to vocabulary.com.
okay. So I think the inherent nature of people is violent. Um, just from like a young, like when you're younger, things you get angry a lot more. Um, and if that isn't taken care of, or it's like taught that hey, that's not good, um, then you would switch sides per se. But like at first, I would say you are of a violent nature.
All right, so I got some thoughts to interject here. This is very good conversation. I like where this is going here. So the first point, yes, I would absolutely agree. Anyone that thinks that human nature is inherently good right from the get go has not seen a toddler throw a temper tantrum. Sorry. So first things first, yes, there's definitely a selfish and not good nature to humans, but there is also innocence and purity in looking at children and toddlers and everything like that. And so it's important to balance these perspectives. I don't think that human nature is to be inherently good. I think we want to be good in our own eyes. Because when you look at the vast majority of people, when you even look at like villains and stuff like the Nazis, most of them believed that they were doing the right thing. They believed they were exterminating the inferior genetic race. Even Hitler and Goebbels. Goebbels was Hitler's head of propaganda. When the Russians were taking over Berlin, one of the high-ranking German officers came to Hitler and he's like, hey, the Russians are right outside Berlin. Shouldn't we get the people out of here? Shouldn't we, be taking care of them and everything? And Hitler's response was, you know what? No, the Russians have proved that they're the superior genetic race. We deserve to be wiped out, civilians and all. And that was his response. And it's a really mind-blowing response, and it shows the depravity of Hitler, but it also shows his perspective, that he believed that he was doing the right thing, that he believed he was doing good from his perspective. No one, maybe there's a couple, but no one as a general rule is the villain in their own story. Everyone thinks that they're the good guy. So that's something that we strive for. That's something that we all strive for, I think, is to be good. But the more that you learn about life, the more that you work to expand your mind and your ways of thinking. This relates to psychology. So part of my degree is I have an interdisciplinary degree in math and psychology. So I'm kind of all over the place. So you'll hear me comment all sorts of thoughts on science and math, and then you'll hear me comment all sorts of thoughts and stuff on psychology, and it's kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. But part of my degree is psychology. So taking a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I don't have them all memorized off the top of my head, but the basic premise of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is it's 5 different categories, and it starts at the bare bones, where you need food, water, shelter, warmth, all of that to physically survive. That is your baseline need. And then from there, it ascends to general social needs. It ascends to having a place of belonging in everything. It ascends to, acceptance and having value to offer others. And all of these ascend to the point of self-actualization. And what Maslow defines as self-actualization is kind of the exploration of who you are and the development of traits of your own character and everything. So kind of what you're talking about here, Trace, of really developing yourself as being good. You think about someone that's, had to always worry about their next meal, their whole life, their whole childhood. They're not really going to care about what's good or evil. They're just going to care about their next meal, But at a certain point, you have your baseline needs met, and you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've had all my baseline needs met. Where can I go from here? And then once you ascend in that hierarchy, you can then prioritize things over that hierarchy. So once you've had self-actualization, you've developed yourself internally. You look at a lot of the Christians in the early church that were executed for their faith. But being a Christian was not a very physically safe thing to do. It would violate the first rule of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But then you look at that from the self-actualization perspective, and they've realized, hey, this belief, this faith is more important to me than my own life even. And they choose that, and they're so convinced of their faith, not a blind faith, that they saw so much evidence for their faith that they're like, you know what, I know where I'm going to go when I die, and I know what'll happen if I give up my faith, and I cannot do that. And so they would make this choice. And so I would say that God, the God of the Bible, this is me more from my Christian perspective talking, but I would say that the God of the Bible kind of helps with that self-actualization process, and he kind of helps with that enlightenment in a sense by providing that ultimate standard of good that you can take and compare and contrast what is good to. And then that helps you, on your journey and everything, where you can maybe do a little bit of this self-actualization on your own, but without that ultimate standard of God to compare to, I mean, you're kind of handicapping yourself again. And that, this is from a Christian theological perspective as well. Those of differing belief systems and religions and everything would have a very different take, and that's totally okay.
I personally, I think I would disagree with that.
Okay.
At least from where I came from, I've reached a point where I'm confident in myself, but I wouldn't say I necessarily got there through God.
Well, right. You don't
That makes
have
sense.
to be a good person. You don't need necessarily to be a quote unquote good person to do certain good things. You don't quote unquote need God. But from a Christian perspective here that we've just outlined, good and God go intertwined in nature, and God has his specific standards that are good, and therefore because good and God are intertwined, those specific standards are the standards. So if you don't have all of the standards and you're not completely conforming to God, you are not able to completely reach good. And I mean, we can't completely reach good even here, even from a Christian perspective in our sinful fallen state. But you are that much more limited in how much you can reach good, because the very first commandment that God gives is that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what goes along with that is then loving your neighbor as yourself. And sure, you can be a kind, good-hearted person and love people and everything. But if you don't have a relationship with God, then you're missing the mark on that very first command that God gives. That's a requirement for being good. So yeah, I think your disagreement comes from maybe a misunderstanding here, where I'm not saying you have to have God to be good and to ascend in self-actualization to be a good person, because you see this existing outside of Christianity with the Dalai Lama and everything like that, and Gandhi and all these other people that would not be Christians but are still capable of good acts. So it's not a requirement that you have to have a relationship with God to be a good person. I think that's a very underdeveloped, logically underdeveloped idea. But to fully reach your potential of what you're able to do, you do have to have that relationship with God. Again, this is from a theological Christian perspective. Totally fine if you disagree, you're coming from somewhere else. Because of the way we're defining God here and the way that we're looking at God through the Euthypro Dilemma and free will, good and God have to be intertwined. So that is our ultimate definition for good. So if we're good in all other areas, but we're missing the mark in terms of like serving God and everything, which is the first requirement in the commandment. Jesus himself even says that, the most important is to love God. If we're missing the mark on that, then we haven't fully reached our potential of being good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that still brings up the point of there are a lot of quote unquote Christians out there that have all that and they think they're good people and they are not. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that God is a requirement for being good still. And I kind of understand what you're saying here, that like by definition they go hand in hand, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's
Yeah,
all the
that
time.
that doesn't mean that
It's
people in
like
church are
saying,
automatically good just because they profess to be Christians. That was Jesus's number one quote unquote enemy, if you will, while he was here, was actually the Pharisees and Sadducees. It was the religious leaders of the day. It wasn't the people that were actively engaged in sin. He had dinner with prostitutes and with tax collectors, which were like the lowest of the low. I mean, tax collectors, to equate it to modern terms, that's like Jesus sitting down and having dinner with your least favorite politician. Your least favorite politician that you would think that you as an individual might have opinions that, they're a backstabber or they're this or that or whatever. That would be the equivalent of Jesus sitting down with that person. That was what it was like in those days. So Jesus' number one point of contention was with these religious leaders. So yeah, you need to have God, but there are going to be plenty of people, and this is biblical. This is in the Gospels. There's going to be plenty of people that get to heaven, and they're going to say, Lord, we did all these things in your name. You did all these good things for you. And Jesus is going to say, get away from me. I never knew you. And I believe those are the people you're talking about, Trace. And so it's still, it's still violating that commandment of loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, because they don't have a relationship with God. The essence of what I'm trying to get at is a relationship here, not just, oh, I'm a Christian, look at me, I do all these good things. To have this ultimate achievement of good to your max potential, it has to go deeper than just professing on a surface level. And I think that's where we're disagreeing, is you're talking about the Christians at church that don't live out their faith and have it on a surface level.
No,
I'm talking about the
no,
Christians
I'm
that
not.
have a relationship with God.
No, I'm not. I'm not just saying from a pure Christian standpoint. I'm just saying, like, I would disagree with you saying that to be purely good, you need to have God in there. I I would disagree with that. I mean, I get where you're coming from, but
Oh,
like,
but yeah, you can do all these
I
good
don't
things.
agree.
Like, think about Gandhi, right? Like, I would quantify him as a good person. He didn't have a relationship with the God of the Bible, but by definition, that's by subjective standards of definition of good. And you could even argue maybe it's objective standards, because he did a good job loving people and promoting peace. But to achieve the max potential of good, I'm not talking about just being good. I'm talking about the max potential for good that we can achieve in our fallen, sinful state from a biblical perspective. It is required by the standards God outlined to have a relationship. That doesn't mean that we still can't be good in some sense. That doesn't mean we still can't have our own moral compass and our own understanding of good that would align in a lot of ways with what God defines as good. But the first requirement, the first commandment from God, the most important commandment, is to love God. And so from that perspective, from the Euthypro Dilemma we've lined out, by definition, to achieve your max potential of good, you have to have that relationship with God. So I think we agree. I think this is a misunderstanding. I'm trying to figure out exactly where it is here. Does that clarify anything for you a little bit?
I mean, kind of, but I think a max potential is also kind of subjective in this case.
Uh,
Because, like, for different people, your max potential for good is going to be different. Like, let's say Steve Irwin, his max potential for good was doing wildlife stuff.
right, being a steward of creation.
For Mr. Rogers, his max potential of good was to teach kids about, all that stuff. So I wouldn't say that
I think you misunderstand how I'm
I think
defining.
it's a case
I
by
think
case thing.
I think you misunderstand how I'm defining max potential for good. I'm not defining it as, oh, they could do more good acts. I'm saying, hey, by definition, God has outlined the first commandment is to love me, love God. That is the first commandment. And so for those that aren't doing that, you are not hitting God's standard of good. So it's not a subjective standard, it's the objective standard of God in this instance. Your thing, I think, unless I'm wrong, you can correct me here, but I think you're taking that and you're saying that subjectively, that if we applied this, that Steve Irwin or Mr. Rogers could have done something more in terms of just their general, acts on earth. That's not so much what I'm getting at necessarily. I think that having a relationship with God might lend a little more credence to being able to do some of that stuff, but that's not necessarily what I'm getting at here. Do you understand the difference now?
Kind of, but whenever you keep saying that God's first commandment is to love me, that just seems a bit narcissistic to me at that point.
I mean, it's a good question to ask. It's a good thought to have. I think
because you're saying that's a requirement. I wouldn't say that's a requirement, because if we have free will, why is that then a commandment? That's like, oh yeah, if you want to be good in my eyes, this is what you have to do. You have to love me. That's just narcissistic at that point. I wouldn't agree with that.
Well, that's not me saying it. That's Jesus saying it. That's in the Gospels. We can take an ad break if you want, and I can find a verse for that. So that's not my claim about God. That's God's claim about himself from Jesus directly. So, from a Christian theological perspective, that is a requirement. I would say, this is why I tied the Euthypro Dilemma into this conversation. Because if that was like Zeus saying, you must love me, then yes, I would say absolutely, that's narcissistic. But we also have to bear in mind the difference here that we outlined in the beginning with the Euthypro Dilemma, that good is God and God is good, and that these natures are intertwined. And so God is both, and he is outlining the standard of what must be done for good in terms of his nature, but also for our best good. Does that make sense?
That still just seems narcissistic, though. Because if you're saying that it's narcissistic for Zeus to say it, then I feel like it has to be the same applied for this one too.
But that's the point.
Because, like, sure, in this whole dilemma thing, the trick question is that it's God is good and good is God, but that just feels too. This isn't quite what I really want to say, but it just seems too metaphorical to me.
I think you lost me on your metaphorical word there. I'm not quite understanding what you're meaning by that.
Just like, you could say God is good, yes, but good is God, I wouldn't necessarily agree with, because you could do a lot of good actions that aren't necessarily in the name of God, and I feel like that's where that statement is coming from.
Yes and no. I mean, Jesus defines this actually in the same verse that I'm referencing, and I should probably find the citation for this here in a second. Let me take an ad break. But Jesus defines this. He's asked what the most important commandment is, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it. Love others as you love yourself. To show love to people. And he says that all of the commandments, or everything in the whole Bible, is summed up into these two broad commandments. And so I think that's kind of, where yes, people can do good things outside of God, but that's still an embodiment of the good of God in a sense of loving people. When you're showing love like that, your motivation might not be your relationship with God, but that is still the principle of love of God. Does that make sense?
I mean,
we're getting deep into the theology here. So tell you what, let's take a quick ad break here. I'm going to find that verse, and then we can kind of figure out the direction where we want to go, because we are getting a little bit over on time here. We're like an hour 15. So let's take a quick ad break here, and then we will jump back in. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, all of you out there, we are back. We actually took a pretty decently long break there. We've come to a conclusion. A lot of it was based out of, I think, just misunderstanding terms and kind of assuming that I assumed Trace was operating under certain definitions. He assumed I was operating under certain definitions, and that kind of minced everything up a little bit. But I'll kick it over to Trace here to kind of summarize the conclusion that we've come to, and then I'll clarify any of his thoughts, and then we'll be wrapping up the show. So over to you, Trace.
Yeah. So we had probably how long was that? Like 20, 15 minutes, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it was good,
But
probably
we
15.
so we just came to the conclusion of like, yes, if you're looking at it strictly from the Christian viewpoint, by definition of that, you would need God to get the max potential of good. But even through the Christian viewpoint and a more secular viewpoint, you don't necessarily need God to do good. There's plenty of chances to do good, plenty of people that do good, but just from what the Bible is saying and that definition, to reach max good, you would need to do it through God or like have God in those actions.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great summary there. It took us a little bit to sort through all the muddied waters of definitions and everything here, but that was kind of our ultimate summary. And I feel like I've kind of been hinting at this throughout the whole show, but we'll state it explicitly here again in case I kind of mixed it or whatever. You don't need to be a Christian to do good things. You don't need that. But by the definition of the Euthypro Dilemma and everything, the whole logical argument that we flowed out of, operating from the Christian worldview, you have to have that relationship with God to be able to reach your max potential of good. Now, if you want to look at that from a different perspective, from like a secular perspective or from a Buddhist perspective or from an Islamic perspective, you might have a very different take on that. And that is your interpretation. That's totally okay. This still follows our template. Right now we're not trying to prove or disprove the validity of Genesis 1-11. We're just taking these ideas and playing with them and having like a fun philosophical that kind of turned theological conversation about it. Any final thoughts you want to interject in there, Trace, or do you want to kick it over to Monster Fact?
No, if you're good, I got my Monster Fact up and ready.
Send it.
Okay, so as many of our listeners hopefully know, our logo is the phoenix. So I figure we should probably do a Monster Fact of the phoenix if that is our whole logo. So it comes from Greek stories, I believe, and it was kind of expanded upon in. I don't know if it's through Egyptian stories or it just kind of takes place in Egypt. But it comes from, I don't know if I can find the author here. Anyway, it's from Greek. So the phoenix, as most people would know, it is a fiery bird, typically depicted as like red and golden. There is a more defined depiction of it somewhere, and I think it's just kind of adds onto the red and gold plumage of it has like a blue beak, purple wings. It kind of gets into like the size of things, like dimensions, not dimensions I want to say, but just like it says like the plumage of it is bigger than a peacock's or something like that. But it's the story that I have in front of me, and it's from what's the book called? You have it.
Oh gosh, give me a second here.
Oh, Bullfinch's Mythology by Thomas Bullfinch. So it from his definition, like translation, I suppose. It lives 500 years. It comes. It carries. Sorry. It carries its parent to the city of Heliopolis in Egypt and deposits it at the Temple of the Sun. It's also covers it in a bunch of just like flammable things. Um, and then it comes out of Arabia, or so the story says. So yeah, the phoenix is an animal um, that is defined by its rebirth from fire. So it'll show up at this temple. Um, I can't see if it says that they light it on fire or it just kind of like combusts in itself. But then out of the ashes of it, it rebirths. It then there's another one. There are some accounts of it that say that there is only one in the entire world, but this story kind of conflicts that because it says that it carries its parent from wherever it lives into Egypt to be reborn. Um,
Now, does it say it's specifically carrying its
but
parent, or does it say that the parent is carrying the offspring?
so, oh man, I
Yeah.
think I think some stories would say that it carries the parent itself, but this one it just says from the body of the parent bird a young phoenix issues forth, destined to live as long a life as its predecessor.
So I think this is kind of more of a nod then at the offspring is inside of the parent, and then the parent kind of sacrifices itself so that the offspring can come out in that blazing flame of fire. Yes, that's kind of the intent here.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I believe so. So, biologically, I mean, you could say this kind of works from, let's say it reproduces asexually and it has an egg that's inside of it. It goes to be burnt or however it might. Yeah, let's just say it goes to be consumed by fire. So then that heat then incubates the egg and then hatches the new phoenix. So you could say that it, I guess, worked biologically, but I'm sure there's all kinds of other nuances in there that would either invalidate it or just make it more complicated.
Yeah, and with myth, it's always hard to tell to what exactly is myth and what exactly is the true facts, if anything, in the myth. And this is something we'll definitely dive deeper into. This is just a creature fact, so this is just kind of a brief exploration here. One thing I'll say is interesting. So I looked this one up. The general understanding of Arabia is that it was to the east of Egypt and Greece and all of that. And so if we're talking about Heliopolis, the phoenix would actually be coming from the east, which is the same direction that the sun rises. I'm not sure if that necessarily means anything, but I think that's an interesting note to say, because like Arabia was kind of like Saudi Arabia. That was kind of like what was understood as like ancient Arabia, I think, either that or like the Persia or something in that category. So I think that's worth noting here as well. And then of all places, it goes to the temple of Heliopolis, the sun god. That's another interesting note there in how it could potentially tie into it could tie into like the idea of the sun and everything, because Heliopolis, the Greek god Helios, is the Greek sun god, and like the concept there is that the sun, S-U-N, was like a chariot that Helios would ride in every single day, and that's what the sun's path was, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an interesting segue into this story, and this is explored in the Atlantis dialogue as well from Critias and Timaeus. But this idea of the there's like a myth that Helios' son, S-O-N, took the sun chariot, S-U-N, and rode in it and burned up a portion of the earth and lost control of it, basically. And the Egyptians tell Solon, who they're talking to at this point. I think I've talked about this before, maybe episode 1. But the Egyptian priests tell Solon. So Solon's this Greek guy that's in Egypt. He had some political trouble, shocker for Greece, and he ran over to Egypt, and he's kind of laying low. And these Egyptian priests are telling him this story, and they're like, hey, you guys have this myth. There's actually truth in here. Now, sadly, they don't specify what the truth is. But it's interesting that you have Helios being referenced here, and you have all these nuances as well. And it does kind of seem like it all threads together in a sense. And it's very interesting, especially in light of this being a specific example of a myth story, that's adjacent to the Phoenix myth, that's referenced by these Egyptian priests as like, hey, you know what, you guys have convoluted this in myth, but there's actually truth in here. So you've got to look at this and start to ask that question and start to wonder, okay, how where do we define the actual the truth that's buried in here? Because I am almost certain that there's truth buried in here, whether it's like, okay, is there a literal bird that comes from the east, or is this maybe just talking about like a comet or something that came very close to the earth? Heck, who knows? Maybe they're talking about a comet or, a meteor that actually impacted the earth somewhere, that would have a cycle of like 500 years. And these are all just, I haven't really done much research into it. I'm just kind of throwing ideas out there, since we're at the end of the show and trying to wrap everything up here. But I definitely want to start interjecting these thoughts into the conversation, because there's a lot of cool stuff with like the Phoenix itself. But let's dive a little bit deeper. What's really being talked about here? And I don't know yet, but that's the intent of the podcast, is to explore it.
I mean, I'm pretty sure the whole underlying meaning of the Phoenix is like, there's a lot of talk coinciding with the sun. It goes to the temple of the sun in Heliopolis. There's all kinds of other stuff that just like kind of makes it akin to the sun. So yeah, it could very well just be like, oh well, the sun rises in the east, Arabia's in the east. Because I also tried to look it up. Because it comes from Arabia. So you'd think, oh, is there a Phoenix myth from Arabia? So not really. The only thing I could find was in Islamic mythology, there is a bird called the anka. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, but it's just some big bird that was. I'd have to dig into it more, but it's just another bird from Islamic mythology.
You know what, Trace? I think this episode, this creature fact that you're giving us here, I think this has prompted an extra subject that needs added into our list of episodes, and that is an episode specifically talking about the Phoenix and comparative mythology of the Phoenix. And I think because we have some good general information here, I think we both owe this some more research, and let's flush this out on a future episode specifically designated towards the Phoenix. And that whole episode will just be a big, long creature fact. What do you think on that?
Oh, yeah, no, I agree, because I just looked it up, and I'm finding a lot more that definitely warrants further investigation. So
sounds good. So unless you got any other thoughts, comments, concessions, confessions, snide remarks, we'll wrap it up here, and I'll start doing the outro. Anything else you got?
No, I think I'm all good.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but not least, all of you with confirmation bias. We appreciate you listening and bearing with us as we kind of fumbled through this conversation a little bit and explored ideas and flushed it out live for you as the listener. If you want to get a hold of us, you can email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. Again, that's m.quad.musings@gmail.com. If you want to leave us a 1-star review on Spotify, that's totally understandable at this point, with us fumbling through this whole conversation here. If you want to get a hold of us on social media, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. And you can search us on Facebook as well. We have a Facebook page that you can like or follow, Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Thanks for joining us for this philosophical that turned theological conversation, and see you next episode.